Fix your shirt, honey. Your collar is
We are going to explore a very deep teaching, which is a teaching which is perhaps closest to my heart. One of the Jewish teachings that most relates to ecological sustainability in the whole Torah. The teaching about the patriarch Jacob, Yaakov Avinu. This just might change your life. The Torah teaches in Bereshit, Genesis chapter 32, verse 25, Vayalan sham balayla hahu vayikach min haba viado mincha le'esav achiv. So Jacob lodged there on that night, and he took from what came into his hand a gift for his brother Esau. The context here is that Jacob is returning from 20 years in Haran, which is now southeastern Turkey. He fled from his brother Esau, who was seeking to kill him. And he on his way back, he came back to the land of Israel, and Esau, his brother, was approaching him with a 400-man militia. The last time he saw Esau or Esav wanted to kill him, and that's why he left. And so the assumption is that when Esav is coming, not with a bouquet of flowers and a caravan of camels with, gifts, but with 400 men, that those men are armed, and Esav will finish what he said he was going to do 20 years prior. That's the assumption that we can make when Esav is coming. And so the Torah teaches that he took what came that Jacob lodged there on that night. He took what came into his hand, a gift for his brother Esau. Vata'avor hamincha al panav v'hulan balayla hahu b'machane. So the gift passed on before him, and he lodged that night in the camp. So Yaakov was giving a big gift to appease his brother Esau. That was one of his strategies. Another strategy was to pray, and another strategy was to divide his wives and children into those that he preferred, so that his most dear ones would escape. Vayakam balayla hu vayikach et shtei nashav ve'et shtei shifchotav ve'et achad asar iladav vayavor et ma'avak yabuk. And he arose during that night, and he took his 2 wives and his 2 maidservants and his 11 children, and he crossed the ford of the Yabuk stream. I learned on Shabbat, the Yabuk is interesting because it's similar letters as Yaakov. It's just missing the ayin. So here Yaakov crosses the Yabuk. Okay, Vayikachem, and today the Yabuk stream is a stream in what's today Jordan, that reaches the Jordan River. Vayikachem, Vayavirem et hanachal, Vayaver et asher lo. And he took them, Jacob took them, meaning his family, and brought them across the stream, and he took across what was his. Vayivater Yaakov levado, vayeavek ish imo ad alot hashachar, and Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. So, one question that arises based on these verses of the Torah is, how could it be that Yaakov leaves his family on one side of the stream and goes on his own in the middle of the night to the other side of the stream? What was he doing? Why does the Torah say, how could it be that Yaakov was left alone? And because at that moment that Yaakov is left alone, what happens, Vayeavek ish imo, ad alot hashachar, is that he wrestles with a man until the dawn, until the break of dawn. That the worst thing that could happen, seemingly, is that he's left alone, and then someone comes and presumably tries to kill him. That he wrestles with that person. This morning I went to a shiur, a class, with Rabbi Daniel Katz, and he talked about how everyone has a mazal that is connected to their soul root. A mazal, you could think of it as an angel of sorts, as a spiritual energy. In other terms, it's called a dat elyon, a higher consciousness. In other terms, it's called keter, expanded consciousness. But there's this idea that there's an angel protecting all of us, and that according to one interpretation, even though the Torah uses the word ish here, a man, but the Torah is really referring to an angel, that Jacob wrestled with an angel of God. Another interpretation is that he wrestled with Esau. Who else is he going to wrestle with in this moment? Another interpretation, he just wrestled with some random man. It's very strange. So the rabbis relate to this question of, well, what was he doing? Why was he left alone? Because it's very puzzling that he would leave his family vulnerable. And the rabbis teach in the Talmud in Masechet Chulin, page 91, and Jacob was left alone. Rabbi Elazar said he remained behind for the sake of some small jars. He was there for pachim ktanim. Hence it is learned that to the righteous their money is dearer than their body. And why is this? Because they do not stretch out their hands to robbery. So here Rabbi Elazar, a Talmudic sage, gives an explanation for what Yaakov was doing alone, is that he was there for some small jars. Okay, and so that begs the question, well, why was he there for small jars? So Rabbi Elazar answers that it is learned that to the righteous their money is dearer than their body. And why is this? Because they do not stretch out their hands in robbery. Chaviv mamonam yoter migufam, which is itself a strange teaching. This whole episode is puzzling. Why would a tzaddik care more about their possessions than their body? Sometimes we think of tzaddikim as ascetics. And here, if he left a few small jars or a few small cups on the other side of the stream, that he went through the water, because there weren't bridges in this time, and he returned to get a few things so that he wouldn't have to steal other cups if he lost these ones. That's the Talmud's understanding, and Rashi quotes this understanding.
Can I get the chronology?
Sure.
From the translation here, I'm a little unclear. He arrived at this place and they camped before they crossed over the river, right? So then he took his family, his 2 wives and his maidservants and his 11 children, and he brought them across the river. Then he came back to get the vessels.
So verse 14, because what I'm quoting here is that we're actually skipping between verses, which is maybe verses 15 to 21.
Verses there. And it's puzzling me which of his children were not around.
Well, so the Torah just says that, I mean, he only had 11 sons at that point,
Okay.
because Binyamin was in Rachel's womb, presumably. But Dinah is not mentioned, and so the sages say that he put Dinah in a box so that Esau wouldn't see Dinah and want to marry her.
Put her in a box.
He hid Dinah away so that Esau wouldn't lay his eyes on her. That's according to our midrash. Now I want to go a little deeper in this because there's a lot of depth in this teaching. Rabbi David Hertzberg, Zichrono Livracha, who was close with Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, cites a teaching of the Imrei Noam, who was Rabbi Eliezer of Jikov, a Hasidic master who lived around 1865. And the Imrei Noam taught, based on an oral tradition, that the olives from the branch that Noah received from the dove were made into pure olive oil. The oil was given to Noah's firstborn son, Shem, Shem, otherwise known as Melchizedek, the priest to the Most High God, sealed this little jar of oil and gave it to Avraham as a gift. Avraham, in turn, handed it over to Yitzchak, who passed it down to Yaakov. In other words, when Noah sent out the dove picked an olive branch, which according to one midrash was from the Garden of Eden. That God didn't flood the Garden of Eden, and there were olive trees that God planted in the Garden of Eden, and the dove plucked a branch from there and brought it to Noah, and from that branch, which had olives on it, Noah made a small amount of olive oil and passed that on to his son Shem, who was Melchizedek, and Melchizedek gave that to Avraham, who gave it to Yitzchak, and Yitzchak gave it to Yaakov. So Yaakov is there, very worried about his own life, but realizes that he has left a small jar of oil, of extremely precious oil. You know, this is almost like a story from Harry Potter. It's like this tiny amount of the holiest oil. So the Rabbi Hertzberg continues, according to our sages, Jacob forgot some small jars on the other side of the Yabok River and returned to retrieve them. One of these jars was the oil from Noah's Ark, which itself was oil from the Garden of Eden. Jacob prophetically hid this oil at the site of the Holy Temple and laid the foundations for the miracle of Hanukkah. This is the oil that originated with the dove, the symbol of peace, and continues to shine until the Messiah comes. So according to this understanding, the oil was extremely special, and therefore Jacob couldn't have left that oil because it was too special to leave, even though he risked his life. But he knew he needed to get that oil, and so that's why he went back for it. And that this oil, once he recovered it, he then hid it at the site of the temple in Jerusalem. And that was the foundation of the miracle of Hanukkah, because perhaps that oil was then the hidden oil that the Kohen Gadol found, or that they found at the site of the temple, which wasn't contaminated by the Syrian Greeks. Any comments or questions?
I have just sort of, I see in verse 24, it says that Yaakov took what was his. So why would it say that if in fact he forgot some small vessels behind? It seems sort of contradictory.
Good. So that's a great question. Vaya'aver et asher lo, and he took across what was his. So therefore, and that's actually the basis for this drosh of the rabbis, because the next phrase, Vayivater Yaakov levado, and he remained alone. Well, what did he remain alone for? Well, it relates to the phrase that preceded it, the words that immediately preceded et asher lo, that which was his, that he forgot something. He brought, Yaakov, the Torah teaches in earlier verses, that he was a man of incredible wealth. He amassed tremendous wealth in the time, in his 20 years with Lavan, especially in his later years. And therefore, when he was moving, it wasn't like our times where, someone hires a moving service and they come with a big truck, or someone is moving internationally, they come with a lift and they put it in the lift. Yaakov had a lot of animals. He had a lot of wives, he had a lot of children, he had a lot of tents, and he did bring, which was his, but he forgot a few things. And that's the drosh, that he therefore went back to get a few things. The Torah, it doesn't say this in the Pshat, but in the drosh, he went back for a few things. Okay? So let's go a little deeper. And I'd like us to look at Rabbi Yisachar Ber Eilenberg, who wrote a book, Tzeda L'Derech. He lived in 16th century Moravia. And Okay, maybe that's he was
He's a prodigy.
yeah, he had lived a long life apparently.
Oh, that guy.
So he quotes the Maharshal, who wrote the Maharshal cites Rashi, because the fact that Rashi cites this midrash means that there's a lot of commentators who then comment on Rashi. There's a book of commentators on Rashi. Okay, and one of them is Maharshal, and that okay, he transferred all that was his. If this is so, why is it written and he was left alone? And that's the question that you just raised. That if it says he took that which was his, then why isn't it? Why was he left alone? It says small vessels because we find that the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Yaakov, you risked your life for a small vessel for my sake, and therefore I myself will repay your descendants through a small vessel for the children of Hasmoneans, who made a miracle through a small vessel. And from where do we find that Yaakov risked his life for a small vessel? It must be here, since it already said, and he transferred all that was his. Why is it written, and he was left alone? It is clearly a small vessel of oil that he wanted to pour on the altar on the pillar in Beit El. This was forgotten, and he returned for it, since it was not his, but rather belonged to the Holy One, blessed be he, to pour. One thing we learned in our session last week is how when Yaakov left Beersheba, and he went to Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheba vayelech Harana. And that when he comes to Beit El, he makes a matzeva, a stone altar, and he pours oil on it. And we then see that when he returns to that same spot, he pours oil again. So according to the Maharshal, who's commenting on Rashi, Jacob risked his life for a small vessel for God's sake, in order to pour oil on this pillar that he set up, and therefore God repays Jacob's descendants through a small vessel for the children of the Hasmoneans, meaning the miracle of Hanukkah. That's the miracle of Hanukkah is a miracle of this pach shemen, this small vessel of oil that the Jews found at the site of the temple when all the other oil was contaminated. They couldn't have pure oil. That's the miracle of Hanukkah. That's why we're celebrating the miracle of Hanukkah. So here, the Maharshal connects Jacob going back for the small vessels with the miracle of Hanukkah. Comments, questions?
What exactly is the significance of pouring the oil on the pillar? Is that like a sacrifice?
Good. Yes. So a matzeva, a pillar, with like one tall stone, a standing rock, as we talked about last week, was used, according to some of the commentators of the Ramban, for pouring oil on it. Whereas a mizbeach, an altar, was used for animal sacrifice in ancient times. So that's a distinction. There was a ritual of pouring oil on a standing rock. Okay, anointing it. And it's probably this is part of the basis of pouring oil on the head of a person to anoint them as a prophet or as a king. That's Moshiach. The Moshiach, the Messiah, is the anointed one. What's he anointed with? With oil, with olive oil.
In what context is it being made holy or?
Yeah, you see, this actually relates to the teaching that we're going into, and it's actually a little bit, it's a little bit strange for us moderns to learn Torah, because the Torah is a little bit cryptic, it's a little bit ancient, and so like you ask, why does someone pour oil on a rock? Well, you could say, why does someone kill an animal and then burn the animal and not eat it? There are offerings that are totally burned, right? Why do they take incense and burn that? What is going on in these religious rituals? So I don't have a full answer.
I can understand the animal sacrifice, but I I can't even think of a reason why to anoint a rock or a pillar. I mean, it's just, it was indicative of the culture of the time that it had large significance to do it.
Yeah, and so
is there not a specific explanation as to why it was done?
So there probably is, and this is I don't know the answer. Tzarich iyun, it requires further explanation, and I would venture a guess that, you know, in our times in this room we have the illumination equivalent to maybe 500 small oil lamps that they would use in ancient times. And we just sort of take this for granted that this room is illumined in a way that like a king's room would be illumined. No, because people in ancient times or pre-modern times couldn't afford to burn 500 oil lamps in one room. It's just they didn't have that amount of resources because they did backbreaking work to harvest that oil and to press the oil, etc. And so my sense of an oil libation, an oil offering, pouring oil on a standing rock, is that it's saying, here's my precious oil. Olive oil is so precious. It's so precious we don't even cook with it. It wasn't mostly used for cooking in those times, the way people cook with it today or using it as salad dressing. In those times, it was the primary use for it was in lighting. And so therefore, to have light in the darkness. And so when a person pours oil, they're saying, I'm giving this to God. I'm making an offering to you, God, of my precious oil. And I'm pouring it on a rock, maybe because it would stain the rock. And it would be a sign of, I offer this here, and you could see it at a later time. That's my guess.
And the rock was a placemark, like a landmark.
Yeah, standing rock. We say to God, don't bury my heart at wounded knee. Jacob had a wounded hip. Jewish people have limped through history. But now it's all coming together. As Rabbi Sutton says, we're living in times our ancestors have been dreaming about for thousands of years. Everything hangs in the balance. It's all this wisdom that we've stored in this little jar, in this little vessel, the scroll that we've brought through the flames, through the cauldron, the fiery cauldron. That's all now we're starting to reveal the scroll, the hidden scroll of Jewish, okay, which is, and this teaching is really the depths of that, because it's about how do we live as spiritual beings in a physical reality. That's the central question occupying God in the Torah. And that's the central question, which is really the key question for the ecological crisis. After the class today, I went up to Rabbi Daniel Katz and I said to him, because he was talking a lot about spiritual healing, about essentially aligning one's dot tachton, one's lower consciousness, with one's upper consciousness, one dot elyon. And once those are aligned, and that opens up a channel for abundance and for health and happiness. And I said to him after the class, well, what about, so I can understand that we need to align our consciousness, but what about our physical actions? What about whether or not we eat sugar and in what quantity? I just saw they started labeling bottles in Israel. If a soda is high in sugar, it says high sugar content on the front of the bottle. And that's a.
Just started, the law was passed over a year ago.
Okay, so I just saw it for the first time.
I haven't seen it yet. I thought they banned it. Okay, good.
And it also just came to me that what white sugar is to the body, fossil fuels are to the economy. And the question, and I saw on a Volvo SUV here, on the place where there's usually a gas tank, it had a little electric plug showing that it's electric. And I said to him, well, what about physical actions? How important is that? To what extent is that important? Or do we just need to focus on consciousness? So he said, and I'll paraphrase what he said, that the illness is one of consciousness, meaning at a deeper level, the root issues, the spiritual roots, are a lack of consciousness. As Henry David Thoreau said, for every 100 people hacking at the branches of the tree of evil, one person's hacking at the roots. And at the same time, we need to live spiritually and physically enlightened lives, meaning we need to exercise, we need to eat healthy food, we need to take time for ourselves, we need to spend time in nature, we need to connect with family and friends and community. It's not just about aligning our consciousness and going in a spiritual journey with God, but it's also about living in a rectified way in the physical world. And that's where this teaching is so deep, and that takes us to Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, in writing in early 19th century Ukraine. And he says as follows: the union between the righteous person and the community of Israel is achieved through masa umatan, doing business. This is because everything in the world has in it sparks of holiness that fell at the time of the shattering of the vessels. Shattering is the aspect of letters that shattered and fell into each and everything of this world. For everything has its time. It must come at that time to that person who shares the same root with those sparks in that thing. Thus, when that thing comes to this person and the person receives vitality from it, i.e. from the shattered letters that are there, through this, the shattered letters are encompassed in this person. In their vitality, they become a complete entity and infuse the vitality of the entire body. Through this, the letters are restored and become complete. Then that thing must stay with this person for him to use until the letters and sparks that are associated with his root terminate. After this, it leaves his or her possession for someone else. The time has come for the remaining letters to have an ascent. They share the same root with that other person and so depart for his or her possession. Let me tell you a story. A few weeks ago, my mother found an amazing pair of pants that someone had put out at the dumpster. In Jerusalem, there's this phenomenon of clothing at dumpsters. People, when they want to get rid of their clothes, they don't put it in a dumpster, they put it next to the dumpster. And some people come and see that it's actually, a lot of it is very good clothing, and then use it. It's sort of like a circular economy, a non-economic exchange. Now, my sense is that most of that clothing actually the sanitation workers in the city then put into the dumpster because no one takes most of it. But my Holy Mother found the most expensive pants that I've ever worn, 100% fine merino wool, made in Portugal, which is a sign of the fineness of the pants, Marks and Spencer. And a person had put it there because there was a small tear on it. So she gave me these pants, which amazingly fit both in the waist and the length. So I didn't have to tailor them otherwise. And I took them to a tailor, and the tailor fixed it, and I wore it this past Shabbat for the first time. So this relates to this teaching of Rabbi Nachman, because he says that everything in the world has in it sparks of holiness that fell at the time of the shattering of the vessel. So the Kabbalah 101 states, and I'm now in my 40th year, so I guess I can start to share with you, my elders, a little bit of the Kabbalistic teachings. When God created the world, there was too much light for the vessel. And so the vessel broke. And when that vessel broke, in creation, in physical creation, there came all these different physical things. You could sort of think of it as like a comet exploding, like all the matter, all the metals in earth. And And so there are sparks of holiness and even letters of holiness. Aleph, Beit, Yud, Hey. There's these letters of holiness in everything in creation, in magnesium and the periodic table of the elements. There's all this, and all of creation. This table here, which my father bought in Cuzco, Peru. It was made by indigenous Peruvians speaking Quechua. So there's sparks of holiness in this wood, which we're now elevating by using it as a vessel for consciousness. We human beings are uniquely capable of certain pursuits of consciousness, which is our responsibility to use our efforts for this. And here, by virtue of our using this table for holiness, the letters, the holy letters and the holy sparks of light, of godliness in this table, in this wood, are now being elevated, lamala. We're rising this above, and the same goes with the glass from this cup and from the rooibos tea that I'm drinking and the water, everything that's passing through you and I as we're learning this, the air, through our engaging in the holy pursuit of Torah study, we are hopefully raising up these sparks of holiness, and with the clothes that we're wearing. And so Rabbi Nachman says that when we have things that come into our possession that are uniquely meant for us, and they infuse the vitality of our entire body. And when we are finished raising up the sparks that are shayach, that are fitting for our own soul, then that item goes on to another person. And Rabbi Nachman says that that person then raises up the sparks themselves. And then item can actually come back to a person after they've gone on a process of spiritual development. And it's about this, the spiritual, the letters, the holy sparks connecting to the soul root of a person, and that person raising it up. So how does that relate to these fine wool made in Portugal pants? Because who here wears clothing that's made in Portugal? It's like to be zoche, to merit, to have there's very few Portuguese tailors that are making clothes for the world market. And so the idea is that physical objects have sparks that we raise up through our holy use, but through our long-term use. It's most things are not raised up by using it once and then disposing of it, which is what leads us to the puzzling question of how could it be that religious society has gone hook, line, and sinker in favor of disposables? Isn't there a fundamental dissonance, a fundamental inconsistency, a contradiction between disposable use, in other words, taking a cup one time and throwing it out, and leading a religiously observant and spiritually aware lifestyle? Isn't there a stira mine rube? Isn't that a contradiction of terms? And how could it even be that there is a hechsher, a certificate of rabbinic approval on some packages of disposable goods? How could that be? How could it be religion in service of a disposable economy?
What is that message then? What, that's kosher?
Oftentimes on the aluminum pans, there is a badatz hechsher, a badatz kosher certification, and what that's indicating usually is that it was made by Jews, and so it's not obligated in ritual immersion, in tevila, as aluminum, because there's a question about maybe you need to take this to a mikvah to immerse this, but there's also hechshers on cleaning products, on bleach, which itself is...
Dish soap has a hechsher.
Just so.
So that touches the plates and things that you eat off of, so that makes sense.
Right, although the halacha says that something which isn't fitting for the eating of a dog doesn't require a hechsher.
Oh,
And so here Rabbi Nachman is revealing to us a very, very deep teaching. It's really the deepest of the depths, that physical objects are part of our spiritual path. Our spiritual avoda, our spiritual work, involves raising up the physical, using things for long-term purposes, and making sure that everything that we purchase, that everything that comes into our possession, we are raising up the sparks that relate to our soul, and only then do we pass it on to another person. The Rabbi Nachman talks about it going on to another person. It's not a question of it being of taking good things and putting them in the dumpster, which is common practice today. Clothes, furniture, mattresses. You look at the dumpsters and you see a disposable society. Things, because in our times, it's oftentimes more expensive to repair something than it is to buy a new one. And this goes for refrigerators, big appliances. But the spiritual work of repairing it means that more of the sparks can be raised up in that object. Comments? Questions?
I have a different comment, and that is that is there in the Torah, is there anywhere that it addresses the issue that here Yaakov has stolen the birthright of his brother, and he's going there, and he's afraid the brother is going to kill him, so he must be going there with an aura of guilt or whatever. Speaking of spirituality, isn't that an issue? That you steal the birthright of your brother, and how do you live on?
Good. So that's another part of this narrative, which we'll relate to now, which is this aspect of how does Yaakov relate to his possessions, and how does Esav relate to his possessions? Because Esav says, Yesh li rav, I have a lot. And Yaakov says, Yesh li kol, I have everything. Which the rabbis interpret, Ezahu Ashir, who is the rich person, Hasamech bechelko, the person who's happy with their lot. And so, and to take it a step further, Jacob, Pharaoh, I can just see that sheet for a second. If I can see your sheet, thank you. Pharaoh says to Joseph, when he's sending Joseph to go meet Jacob, his father, Jacob then goes to Egypt. So when there's famine in the land of Israel, Pharaoh says, "Ve'einechem al tachos al klechem ki tuv kol eretz Mitzrayim lachem hu." And let your eye not be concerned about your vessels, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. Very cryptic verse. There's very few lines that the Torah records of Pharaoh speaking to Joseph or to the interaction with Jacob. But one of the main things that Pharaoh says to Joseph about Jacob is, don't worry about your vessels, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. Now, Egypt is to Israel what America is to Israel today. Today, because Egypt is a second world country, we sort of lose sight of the fact that when the Torah refers to Egypt, it's really referring to what we today think of as America or the West, this very fertile and abundant place. Because in Pharaoh's land, they don't worry about their small vessels because they have so much abundance. And so therefore, Pharaoh's message to Jacob, he heard about Jacob, the vessel man who goes back, who risks his life for his vessels. And so Pharaoh says, in the land of abundance, we don't care about that. We just drink and throw it out. and that's the worldview of Pharaoh. But in the worldview of Jacob, who is is that no, everything that comes into his possession needs to be raised up, and that's part of his avoda, spiritual work. And maybe to relate more fully to your question, we'll talk about it afterward.
But Jacob, it sounds like he also had, he was fine-tuned to the significance of, seems to me, not necessarily the vessels, but the oil that was in them because of the holiness of the oil. Am I hearing that correctly?
Good. So that you're bringing out, a question that the rabbis deal with, which is, according to this Talmudic teaching, that he went back for these small vessels. Well, what was so important about the small vessels? So one aspect of it, in which Rabbi Nachman's teaching brings out, is that the vessels themselves were significant. Not that they were expensive vessels. This wasn't fine china through the Silk Route, which may not have existed at that time. But it was just the fact that these were his possessions that he had not yet fully raised up in holiness, and therefore he had to go back, and we'll bring that out a little more with the Pri Tzadik. But another understanding is the oil inside. But in whatever the understanding is, the deeper teaching is that, as the words you use, fine-tuned. That a tzaddik, a righteous person, is fine-tuned to how they live in the physical world and how they consume, which is interesting, because sometimes people think, as I said before, that there's this thing called religion and there's this thing called ecology. Religion is on one side and ecology is on the other side. Many people think religion is on the right and ecology is on the left. But here we're seeing that Jacob, the patriarch, the archetype, meaning that his life was a model for all of us and it reverberates through the generations, that here he engages in a behavior that only the most committed environmentalists do today. If you've heard of the phenomenon of dumpster diving, of actually going into a dumpster to recover the edible packaged food that supermarkets are required by law to throw out because it passes expiration date, but which in many cases is still good food. And recover, in many cases, thousands of dollars worth of food, but have to avoid the police because it's officially illegal to do that. And so here, Jacob is mindful of his possessions and is mindful of not to even for the smallest things. And he is a religious person. And you could even say that he was an environmentalist.
Well, I'm thinking of the term, isn't it called packing out your stuff?
Mm-hmm.
So if one looked at his action from an environmental, 21st century environmental standpoint, one could say he didn't want to leave a mess on the other side. And he didn't want to, have somebody else find it and clean it up or just leave it there.
Okay, good. So that would be a more modern reading of the ethic called leave no trace. Although there's another teaching in the Torah that I think is more suited to that idea, which is that an Israelite soldier is required to carry a shovel as part of their gear so that they don't defecate in the outdoors without covering it over. That the Israelite army, even in the exigencies of war, is not allowed to deface the land with their excrement. Okay? That's a mitzvah. That's one of the 613 commandments. Okay? The last teaching I want to share together is a teaching of the Pri Tzadik, Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen Rabinowitz, who was born in Kreisberg in 1823, died in Lublin, Poland in 1900. And is here where it says that for the righteous their money is more dear to them than their bodies, so that they do not come to steal, which is a teaching of the Talmud in several places, can be understood understood to mean that they do not take that which is not destined for them from God. The above teaching calls it stealing based on the teaching of the Talmud, that it is as if that person is stealing from God and the Jewish people, since to God is the land and its fullness. It's a verse in Psalms. That which is not created for this specific person is like stolen property when they are in possession of it, and thus the righteous are careful not to take possession of it. Because of this, property that is assigned to and created for them is very precious to them, so much so that our patriarch Jacob risked his life for his property. Thus the Ishbister Rebbe heard from his Rebbe of Preshiska, who said in the name of the Yehudi HaKadosh, which are 3 generations of Hasidic Rebbes of Preshiska, which is really going back to the legacy of the Baal Shem Tov. A righteous person is obligated to enjoy an object which is fitting for them, even if it means risking their life. That is why Jacob, who knew that the small vessels were his, appropriate to his soul, and created for him, risked his life to save them. So too with all the silver and gold that they, the Jewish people, took out of Egypt, they sought to extract the holiness that was trapped inside of the wealth. And that's really a big part of Jewish and a more broader level of religion, which is how can we partake of the physical world in holiness? You know, the ecological crisis is really just messaging that humanity is partaking of the physical world in an unholy way. That's one of the messages that of the ice caps melting, the rainforest burning, the deserts expanding, the planet heating. So it's not about fossil fuels. It's not, at a deeper level, it's about, are we engaging with physicality in holiness? And if humanity does that, then the earth will come to balance. And if humanity decides to live a life of excess and of disposability, of convenience, if the primary motivations are that we want it to be convenient, then yes, that's how many religious families use only disposable products. Because it's just too much time to wash the durable vessel. But if the priority is raising up the sparks of holiness, then we'll come to see that we can forge a spiritual path that is both spiritual and ecological, and that actually the two are together. That's why these sessions are called Jewish spirituality and ecological sustainability. It's about that the spiritual act is part and parcel an ecological act. The two are fused. Spiritual ecology. They go together. They come together. It's one. Hakol echad. That living in resonance with God's consciousness means living in resonance with the planet that God created. So my hope and blessing is that we'll be able to rise to the challenge, that we'll be able to connect our dot tachton, our lower consciousness, with our dot elyon, our higher consciousness. And by aligning the two, that's the Sulam Yaakov, that's Jacob's ladder. And then we'll see the angels going up and down, the spirituality flowing and infusing our lives and all of creation with vitality. Zvat Hashem.
So I have 2 comments. One, there's no picadon on liter bottles, right, of juice and soda. Do you know why?
Yes.
You probably do know why.
I do know why.
My understanding is that the Haredi faction of the Knesset resisted, I don't know if it was the Knesset, wherever the law is created to impose that 30 agarot or whatever it is deposit, they don't want to do it because they said it was too much of a encumbrance for them to have to bring the bottles back.
Yeah, so it reflects an irony that the religious parties in the Israeli government today, but also the religious voters in Brazil, the Christian religious voters in Brazil and the United States, the Hindu religious voters in India, or some of them, Muslim religious voters in other places. It's not just a Jewish phenomenon, it's a phenomenon of religion today, which is that the religious parties tend to be the least concerned for ecological sustainability, while the secular parties, like the Green Party in Germany, is the most ecological party, while the Christian Democrats, while still ecological, because the Germans are actually much more ecological than almost any country, but the Christian Democrats are less ecological than the Green Party. And so, yes, that's an irony, but that's part of why we're learning this, which is to reveal this connection of spiritual ecology. Because in the educational system and in the synagogues and in the yeshivot, in those communities, these teachings are not emphasized. But if they were emphasized, I think there would be a different political platform.
It doesn't seem like it would be contradictory to their platform. It's not, most parties are concerned if they take a position on something, is it going to alienate some part of their faction?
But it does. The reason that that some of the religious parties in Israel opposed a deposit for certain disposable plastic bottles is because they want to ensure cheap access to their constituents for soda. And to put a deposit value on some plastic bottles would make that more difficult. That was their opposition, as I understand it.
If you do the math, you buy 20 bottles.
No, but because many of the families most of the families that vote for those parties are living below the poverty line. And if you look at their annual consumption of disposable plastic bottles, it's huge. Right. And so therefore to add, 10 agarot or 30, no, but you only get it back if you bring it. And also, but that requires an effort to bring it back, and for large families, where this isn't the focus, so then that's part of why they opposed it.
So aside from the attempt to enlighten them through their religious leaders,
Mm-hmm.
how else do you foresee making a change in not only disposable plastic bottles, but disposable plastic plates, cutlery, cups, you name it? Not only for holidays, but, on a regular basis.
Well, the change that I envision begins in education. It begins with, wow, we just came from Parshat Vayishlach, which contains, through these, 7 sources that we learned together, including some of the heavy hitters in Jewish teaching over the last several hundred years, but also going back to the Talmud and Rabbi Elazar, but really going back to Jacob, but as we saw, going back to Noah and going back to the Garden of Eden. That here, this is Jewish. These are some deep Jewish teachings. Let's talk about them. What I envision and what I pray for, and may God give us the resources to manifest this, is let's have a campaign so that rabbis teach and preach on ecological sustainability in their synagogues. And let's have a campaign to bring these teachings into the religious educational system. The triumph of disposables in particular, but the triumph of consumer culture in general, comes partly through the silence of clergy. Clergy and religion is the only force in the world that can put up a good fight to consumer and disposable culture, but they've chosen to duck out, chosen to acquiesce to the ascendance of disposables. But I think the time has come to change that. And this year, a group of rabbis wrote a letter calling on Jews to reduce their use of disposables. And that letter campaign received one of the Nechama Rivlin presidential prizes for ecological sustainability in Israel last month.
Partly to answer your question also, the government can legislate, which they just passed a policy now that Jerusalem Ganim are going hot pommy free. I don't know, I guess next year or whenever.
Yes, I saw
So
that.
bit by bit, if they're not going to acquiesce voluntarily, then they'll be forced to at some point. France is banning plastic. I mean, there's several European countries that are just outright banning. I think San Francisco banned plastic water bottles.
Along, yeah.
So
and-
eventually it'll just be legislated down and it'll disappear. I don't know what the solution is.
I know, I think in
The
addition,
alternative is,
sure.
But-
I think the one very good resource or avenue is through the pocketbook. And I think also if it were legislated to make disposables very expensive, then these families would likely reduce their use.
Mhm.
Or buy them and then reuse them, because some of these plastic plates are very reusable.
Great. May God bless us in these efforts.
I have another comment. I don't know if you want to continue the discussion.
Is it related to
It's related to this
Okay.
one on a different track. I mean, I'm following through all these proportions here on the holiness of physical objects. I really can relate to that myself and understand it up until the point where this last comment here says that it's that a tzaddik or anybody, a righteous person, is obligated if it means they have to risk their life. I don't get that. I mean, even if these little vessels are holy, even if we don't want to lay waste to the landscape or whatever it is, but why put yourself in harm's way for a small amount of? And it also it just sounds to me too much like coveting too materialistic to me. Too much being too possessive of really, I don't want to say meaningless, but because we just really come to an understanding that they're not meaningless. Even these glass jars have some holiness in them that makes them meaningful. But I don't understand the idea of putting yourself in harm's way.
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you, Rebecca and Kent and Eliyahu for watching, as well as Rabbi Lori Matskin and others. And then your question, Yoshua, really, it brings us to the full circle with the teaching, and I appreciate it because that's actually the essential point of this whole teaching. Yeah, that the Torah says that Jacob brought his possessions across the Jabbok stream and he was left alone. The rabbis interpret that to mean that he went back for the sake of some small jars, because Rabbi Eliezer says that for the righteous, their possessions are dearer to them than their body, which is then brought out by Rav Tzadok HaKohen, that it's appropriate, that this is why Jacob, who knew that the small vessels were his, appropriate to his soul and created for him, risked his life to save them, which brings out the absurdity of it. Well, why didn't he risk his life to save his family at that moment? Why was he risking his life to save these vessels? Oh my God, what's going on in the Torah? This is so weird. And what the Hasidic rabbis are revealing to us is that no, this isn't weird. This is what life serving God is all about. That we're only here to live conscious, righteous lives. And the way we do that is by raising up the physical through the long-term holy use of material possessions. And Rav Hirsch writes this in his commentary on Bal Tashchit, do not destroy, that when we think of ourselves as the master of creation, we then have pride and ego, arrogance, and we then come to waste things and to destroy them. And so the reason that Jacob goes back for these small vessels is because he realizes that his whole spiritual path is dependent on him doing this. And thank you for revealing this, because and that's why the same verse, Vayivater Yaakov levado vaye'avek ish imo ad alot hashachar, at that moment in the same verse, when he is left alone, is when the angel of Esau, or maybe it was Esau or someone else, another man, wrestles with him. And at that moment, when everything hangs on the balance, when the next verse could say, and Jacob was killed, left alone, going back for a few measly clay cups that he should have left behind. And so ends the Torah. What a sad story of Jacob. No, at that moment, Jacob reaches for the vessel. He grabs the vessel. He puts it in his cloak. And at that moment, the angel or Esau comes with a long axe and starts to come striking him. And Jacob, all of a sudden, he is so empowered by his spiritual fulfillment, by his connecting his lower self with his upper self, that he says, he does this like amazing taekwondo move of where he like dodges the long axe. And then the angel comes with another dagger and he throws this like ninja star. And Esau just like says like the name of God. And he's like, she just like says, and like he totally disarms this angel. Well, how does he do it? It's not because Jacob is like this super strong man, because he's sort of old at this point in his life and he has 13 or maybe 25 children. And he's been shepherding. How does he do it? The reason he does it is because he's shalem. He is spiritually aligned with his purpose, and no assassin is going to take him out. At El Chapo, there's the New York Times had an article on the front page today about one of the 100 assassins that was doing El Chapo's work. Okay, the dark, dirty work. But here Jacob is a ninja. But the reason he's a ninja and he fights the angel and he defeats the angel, the reason he can do that is because he's spiritually aligned. And how is he spiritually aligned? Through going for the small vessels, through living. He's the eco warrior. Okay, that's what he's doing. Thank you.